The Silent Bellmaker of Prague, a tale of Bohemia in the year 1518. In the year 1518, the city of Prague stood tall and proud beside the river Vltava. The streets were narrow and cold in winter, and warm and golden in summer. Bells rang from every corner of the city. They rang from tall churches. They rang from small chapels. They rang from the great cathedral on the hill. Every bell had its own voice. Every bell had its own song. In a small house near the river lived a man named Jakub. He was known across Prague as the finest bellmaker in all of Bohemia. His hands could shape bronze the way a poet shapes words. His ear could hear a single flaw in a bell from 100 steps away. Yet Jakub never spoke. Not one word left his lips. Not a whisper, not a sound. The people of Prague called him the Silent Bellmaker. Jakub had not always been silent. As a boy, he laughed loudly. He sang old Bohemian songs with his mother in the kitchen. He shouted across the fields when he played with the other children. His voice was strong and clear, like a bell freshly cast. When Jakub was 10 years old, a great fever swept through the city. It came in the autumn and stayed through the winter. Many children grew sick. Many did not survive. Jakub survived, but something was taken from him. When the fever finally broke, he opened his mouth to speak, and no sound came out. His throat worked. His lips moved. But the voice that once lived inside him had vanished, as quietly as smoke leaving a chimney. The healers of Prague tried many remedies. They gave him warm broths and bitter herbs. They prayed over him in the old stone churches. Nothing brought his voice back. As the months passed, the boy who once sang loudest in the village became the boy who never spoke at all. His mother worried for him deeply. She feared he would grow lonely and sad, cut off from the world by his silence. But Jakub was not sad, not for long. He found another way to speak. He found it in the workshop of his uncle, a bellmaker named Old Havl. Old Havl had no sons of his own. When he saw how the young boy watched him work, quiet and still for hours at a time, he offered to teach him the trade. Jakub agreed with a simple nod, and from that day forward, the workshop became his true home. The workshop stood near the river, in a low stone building with a tall chimney. Inside, there were furnaces that glowed orange through the night. There were molds of clay and wax, shaped like great upside-down cups. There were tools of every size, hammers and files and long iron rods. The air always smelled of smoke and hot metal. Old Havl taught Jakub everything he knew. He taught him how to mix the bronze, using 9 parts copper to 1 part tin, the old and trusted formula passed down through generations of bellmakers. He taught him how to build a mold from clay and wax, layer by careful layer. He taught him how to pour the molten bronze at just the right moment, when the metal glowed like a small sun. Most of all, Old Havl taught him how to listen. A bell was not simply a shape of metal. A bell was a voice waiting to be born. Every bell, once it cooled and was struck for the first time, sang its own note. Some bells sang deep and solemn tones, fit for funerals and solemn masses. Some bells sang bright and joyful tones, fit for weddings and festivals. The shape of the bell, the thickness of its walls, the mixture of its metal, all of these things decided what voice the bell would have. Jakub, though he could not speak himself, developed an extraordinary gift for shaping the voices of bells. It was as if all the sound that could no longer pass through his own throat instead flowed through his hands and into the bronze. He would run his fingers along a half-finished bell mold, feeling for imperfections that no other bellmaker could sense. He would tap a cooling bell gently with a small hammer and know, from the faintest vibration, exactly what tone it would sing. Once fully formed by the time Jakub was 20 years old, old Havl had grown too old to work the furnace himself. He passed his workshop, his tools, and his secrets to his silent nephew. The people of Prague soon learned that the mute young man in the workshop by the river could craft bells finer than any master in the land. Merchants and priests came from distant towns to commission his work. Though he never spoke a single word to them, his bells spoke loudly enough for everyone to understand. Prague in the year 1518 was a city that lived by the sound of bells. They marked the hours of the day. They called the faithful to prayer. They warned of fires and floods. They celebrated weddings and mourned the dead. A city without bells would have felt like a body without a heartbeat. Jakub understood this better than anyone. He walked the streets of Prague often, though he never joined the crowds who gathered to talk and gossip in the market squares. Instead, he stood beneath church towers, listening. He could tell, simply by the sound, which bells had been cast poorly and which had been cast with true skill. He could hear cracks forming in old bronze long before they became visible to the eye. The people of Prague grew used to seeing him this way, standing alone beneath a bell tower with his head tilted upward, his eyes closed, completely still. Some thought him strange. Others thought him touched by God, given a special gift to make up for the voice he had lost. Children sometimes followed him through the streets, curious about the silent man who spoke through bronze instead of words. One boy in particular, a baker's son named Toman, became fond of following Jakub. Toman was perhaps 8 years old, full of questions and utterly unafraid of the bellmaker's silence. He would walk beside Jakub for hours, chattering about anything that came to his mind, never expecting an answer and never receiving one, yet somehow feeling that Jakub was listening all the same. It was Toman who first asked Jakub, using words and gestures together, whether he missed his voice. Jakub thought about this question for a long moment. Then he led the boy to his workshop, picked up a small handbell from a shelf, and rang it gently. The bell sang a clear, sweet note that seemed to hang in the air of the workshop for a long time before fading away. Jakub looked at Toman and pointed at the bell, then placed his hand over his own heart. Toman understood, or believed he did. The bell was Jakub's voice now. Every bell he made carried a piece of the words he could no longer speak. In the spring of that year, word came from the royal court that the great cathedral of Prague required a new bell. The old bell in the highest tower had cracked during a terrible storm the previous winter. Lightning had struck the tower, and though the stone walls survived, the ancient bell inside did not. Its voice, once heard across the entire city and the fields beyond, had fallen silent. The Bishop of Prague announced that a new bell must be cast, one greater and finer than any bell the city had ever known. It would be called the voice of Bohemia, and it would ring out not only for church services, but for the coronations of kings, the birth of royal children, and moments of great importance to the entire kingdom. Every bellmaker in Bohemia wished to win this commission. It was the greatest honor a craftsman in this trade could hope to achieve. Bellmakers came from Brno, from Pilsen, from towns along the borders of Bohemia, each hoping to present their skills before the bishop and the royal council. Jakub did not travel to present himself before the council. He had no need to boast of his work, for his reputation had already traveled far beyond the walls of Prague. Instead, one quiet morning, two royal messengers arrived at his workshop by the river. They carried a letter sealed with the bishop's own mark, requesting that Jakub the silent bellmaker undertake the casting of the voice of Bohemia. Jakub read the letter slowly, his hands, usually so steady around hot metal and sharp tools, trembled slightly as he held the parchment. This was the greatest challenge of his life, and he knew it would demand everything he had ever learned, and perhaps more than he currently knew. He nodded to the messengers, accepting the commission with the same simple gesture he used for everything. That night, he did not sleep. He sat in his workshop long after the furnace fires had died down, staring at the tools his uncle had left him, thinking of the voice this new bell would need to carry. It would need to be a voice great enough to speak for an entire kingdom. News of Jakub's commission spread quickly through Prague, and not everyone received it with joy. Among the bellmakers who had hoped to win the honor was a man named Bedřich, a skilled craftsman from a wealthy family with a workshop on the other side of the city. Bedřich had spent years building his reputation, casting bells for smaller churches and noble estates. He believed, with great confidence, that he deserved this commission far more than a silent man who could not even speak to explain his own work. Bedřich went before the bishop and argued that a mute craftsman could not properly understand the sacred purpose of the bell, that a voice was needed to guide such important work, and that Jakub's silence made him unsuitable for a task meant to give voice to the entire kingdom. The bishop listened politely, but he had already seen Jakub's bells ringing in towers across Bohemia, and he trusted the quality of the man's work more than the volume of his words. Still, Bedřich did not give up easily. He began spreading rumors through the taverns and marketplaces of Prague, suggesting that a silent man was cursed, that his inability to speak was a sign of some hidden sin, and that his bells, however fine they sounded, might carry some unseen flaw within them. Some people, easily swayed by fear and gossip, began to whisper these same doubts to their neighbors. Jakub heard none of these rumors directly, for people rarely spoke to him at all. But Toman, the baker's son, heard them in the market square, and he ran to the workshop to tell Jakub everything. His young voice full of worry and anger on his silent friend's behalf. Jakub listened to the boy's account with a calm expression. He did not seem troubled by Bedřich's words. Instead, he simply returned to his work, continuing to sketch designs for the great bell on scraps of parchment scattered across his workbench. Toman asked him if he was not afraid that people would believe the rumors. Jakub set down his charcoal, picked up a small bell from the shelf, and rang it softly. The sound was pure and true, untouched by any curse or flaw. He looked at Toman and gestured toward his own ears, as if to say, "Let them listen, and let the bell answer for itself." The casting of a bell as large as the voice of Bohemia required months of careful preparation. Jakub began by building a great pit beneath his workshop, deep enough to hold a mold twice the height of a grown man. He dug through soil and old stone with the help of 2 hired laborers, strong young men from the countryside who did not mind the silence of their employer, since the work itself required little conversation. The mold for a bell was built in 3 layers. First came the core, a solid shape of brick and clay, built up from the bottom of the pit, matching the exact inner shape the bell would eventually hold. Jakub worked on this core for many weeks, checking its curves again and again with wooden templates he had carved himself, templates shaped to match the precise profile he wanted the bell to have. Next came the false bell, a layer of wax and clay built over the core, matching exactly the shape and thickness the bronze bell would eventually take. This was the most delicate part of the entire process, for even a slight unevenness in this layer would create a flaw in the finished bell, a place where the metal would be too thin or too thick, throwing off the tone in ways that could never be corrected afterward. Jakub spent long days and longer nights shaping this false bell, running his hands over every inch of its surface, feeling for imperfections with the same sensitivity another man might use to read a letter written in the dark. He inscribed decorations into the wax as well, following an old Bohemian tradition. Images of saints and patterns of vines circling the bell's great shoulder, along with words that would be cast permanently into the bronze. For these words, Jakub could not choose them himself, since he had long ago lost the habit of forming sentences, even in writing, preferring to let his bell speak for him, rather than choosing phrases with his own hand. He asked the bishop's scribe, through careful gestures and written notes, to select an inscription worthy of the great bell. The scribe chose a simple blessing, asking that the bell's voice carry peace and protection over the city of Prague and all of Bohemia for as long as its bronze endured. Finally came the outer layer, called the mantle, built of clay, reinforced with iron bands, forming the shell that would hold the molten bronze in its proper shape during the pour. Once this outer layer had dried and hardened in the sun for many weeks, the entire mold was ready for the most dangerous and dramatic part of the process, the melting and pouring of the bronze itself. As the day of the casting approached, Jakub found himself troubled by doubts he had never experienced before. In his long career as a bellmaker, every previous bell he had made, no matter how important, had been created for a single church or a single town. This bell would be heard across an entire kingdom, and its voice would be remembered for generations, long after Jakub himself had passed from this world. He worried that his gift, so trusted for small bells and modest commissions, might not be enough for a bell of this size and importance. He worried about the words Bedřich had spread through the city, wondering whether they held some hidden truth he could not see in himself. Could a man who had lost his own voice truly create a voice great enough to speak for an entire people? These doubts kept him awake many nights, sitting beside the great mold in the darkness of the pit beneath his workshop, running his fingers along its clay surface, as if searching for answers hidden within its curves. During one of these long nights, Toman found him there, having slipped away from his father's bakery to check on his silent friend. As he often did when he sensed something troubled him, Toman sat beside Jakub in the darkness and asked him plainly why he looked so worried. Jakub, unable to answer with words, took the boy's hand and placed it against the cool clay of the mold, then guided his small fingers along the curve where the bell's rim would eventually form. He wanted Toman to feel what he felt, the weight of responsibility resting inside that empty shape. Toman, young as he was, understood something important that Jakub himself had temporarily forgotten. He reminded his friend, in the simple, honest way that children often speak, that every bell Jakub had ever made carried a piece of his heart within it, and that this bell, being so much greater than the others, would simply carry more of that heart than any bell before it. He told Jakub that a voice did not need to come from a throat to be true. Sometimes, he said, the truest voices came from somewhere else entirely. Jakub sat with these words for a long while after Toman had gone home to sleep. Slowly, the doubt that had gripped him began to loosen its hold. He rose from beside the mold, lit a small lamp, and began once more to check every measurement, every curve, every careful detail of the work he had already completed. By the time morning light reached the pit beneath his workshop, his hands were steady again, and his heart was settled on the task ahead. The day of the casting arrived on a warm morning in early summer. Word had spread throughout Prague that the silent bellmaker would pour the bronze for the voice of Bohemia that very afternoon, and crowds began gathering near the workshop long before the sun reached its highest point. Nobles and commoners stood side by side along the riverbank, all eager to witness the creation of a bell that would ring for generations to come. Inside the workshop, Jakub worked with quiet intensity. 2 great furnaces had been burning for 3 full days, melting down carefully measured blocks of copper and tin until the metal glowed white-hot within their stone chambers. The temperature had to be exact, too cool, and the bronze would not flow properly into every corner of the mold, leaving gaps that would ruin the bell's tone forever. Too hot, and the metal might be weakened, making the bell prone to cracking under the force of its own ringing. Jakub tested the molten bronze the way his uncle had taught him many years before, dipping a thin iron rod into the glowing liquid and watching carefully how it dripped and cooled upon withdrawal. When the color and flow matched exactly what experience had taught him to look for, he knew the moment had come. He raised his hand to signal his assistance, and together they opened the channels connecting the furnaces to the waiting mold below. The molten bronze poured forth in a brilliant stream, glowing orange and gold, flowing down through carefully carved channels into the empty space between the core and the outer mantle of the mold. The crowd outside grew silent themselves, watching smoke and sparks rise from the workshop chimney, sensing the importance of the moment happening within. The pouring took nearly an hour as bronze from both furnaces flowed steadily into the mold, filling every curve and hollow that Jakub had shaped so carefully over the preceding months. When the final drops had settled and the channels ran empty, Jakub stepped back from the mold, his face and arms streaked with soot and sweat, his eyes fixed on the now hidden shape of the bell, cooling slowly beneath the earth. There was nothing more to do but wait. A bell of this great size would need many days to cool properly before it could be safely removed from its mold. Jakub sat beside the covered pit through that first long night, unwilling to leave the bell alone during its most vulnerable hours, listening for any sound that might signal trouble within the cooling bronze. 9 days passed before Jakub judged the bell ready to be freed from its clay shell. During those long days, all of Prague seemed to hold its breath, waiting to learn whether the great casting had succeeded or failed. Even Bedřich, despite his earlier doubts, found himself among the crowd that gathered on the appointed morning, curious, despite himself, to see what the silent man had created. The breaking of the mold was slow and careful work. Jakub and his assistants chipped away at the hardened outer mantle, piece by piece, revealing gradually the bronze surface hidden beneath. The crowd watched in near silence as more and more of the great bell came into view, its surface catching the morning sunlight with a dull golden gleam, its decorative bands of saints and vines emerging exactly as Jakub had shaped them in wax many months before. When at last the final pieces of the outer mold fell away, the voice of Bohemia stood revealed in full, taller than a grown man and wider than 3 men standing arm in arm. The crowd gasped at its size and beauty, murmuring among themselves about the skill required to create something so vast and so finely detailed all at once. But a bell's true worth could not be judged by sight alone. It had to be heard. Workers used a great wooden crane, built specially for this purpose, to lift the bell carefully from the pit and suspend it temporarily from a heavy timber frame constructed nearby. Jakub inspected every inch of the bronze surface first, running his hands slowly across its curves, searching for any hairline crack or flaw that might have formed during the cooling process. He found none. The bronze was smooth and solid, exactly as he had hoped it would be. The bishop himself arrived to witness the first ringing of the bell, along with members of the royal court and a crowd that had grown to include nearly every citizen of Prague who could make their way to the riverbank that day. Jakub took up a great wooden mallet, the largest he owned, and approached the suspended bell with steady hands, though his heart pounded within his chest. Louder than any bell had ever rung, Jakub stood before the great bell for a long moment before striking it. He thought of his uncle, old Havl, who had taught him everything he knew and who had passed away several years before, never living to see this greatest achievement of his nephew's skill. He thought of his mother, who had watched her laughing son fall silent as a child and had never once stopped believing he would find his voice again, in whatever form it might take. He thought of Tolman, standing somewhere in the crowd with his father, waiting with the same excitement that had carried him through every stage of this long journey. He raised the mallet high and struck the bell with all the strength in his arms. The sound that followed silenced every voice in the crowd. It began deep and low, a tone that seemed to rise up from the very earth beneath their feet, then swelled outward and upward, filling the sky above Prague with a note so rich and pure that many in the crowd felt tears rise unexpectedly to their eyes. The sound rolled across the river, echoed off the stone walls of the surrounding buildings, and carried far beyond the city itself, reaching the fields and villages that lay beyond Prague's ancient walls. It was, everyone agreed, in the moments and years that followed, the finest bell ever cast in the kingdom of Bohemia. Its voice was deep enough for solemn occasions and bright enough for joyful ones, capable of carrying both sorrow and celebration within the same bronze throat. The bishop declared that the bell would be raised into the highest tower of the cathedral within the month, where it would ring out over Prague for as long as the city itself endured. Bedřich, standing near the edge of the crowd, said nothing as the bell's voice faded slowly into silence once more. Whatever doubts he had once spread through the taverns of Prague seemed small and foolish now, drowned out entirely by the truth of what he had just witnessed. He approached Jakub afterward, and though the words did not come easily to him, he offered a respectful bow, acknowledging without speaking that he stood before a master far greater than himself. In the weeks that followed, the voice of Bohemia was raised into the highest tower of Prague's great cathedral, where it has rung ever since over the city and its people. Every hour, every festival, every moment of joy or sorrow that touched the kingdom, the bell's voice was there to mark it, carrying across rooftops and rivers and fields, exactly as Jakub had hoped it would. Jakub himself never spoke of the bell with pride, for he never spoke at all, but those who knew him well noticed a change in him after its completion, a quiet peace that seemed to settle over him whenever the great bell rang out above the city. He would often stand beneath the cathedral tower during evening prayers, listening to the deep tone he had created, his eyes closed and his face calm, as though finally hearing his own voice returned to him after all those years of silence. Toman grew older in the years that followed, eventually taking up work in his father's bakery, though he never stopped visiting the workshop by the river whenever he had a spare afternoon. He often told the story of the silent bellmaker to younger children in the neighborhood, explaining how a man who could not speak had created the greatest voice in all of Bohemia, a voice that would outlast every person who had witnessed its creation. Jakub continued his craft for many more years, casting smaller bells for churches and towns across the kingdom, though none would ever match the fame of the voice of Bohemia. He trained young apprentices of his own eventually, teaching them, as his uncle had once taught him, that a bell was not merely a shape of metal, but a voice waiting to be born, and that the finest voices often came from the most unexpected places. Long after Jakub had passed from this world, the people of Prague continued to tell his story. They spoke of the boy who lost his voice to fever, and the man who found a new voice in bronze and fire. They spoke of the great bell that still rang above the cathedral, its deep tone carrying the same peace and protection the bishop's scribe had once inscribed into its surface. Travelers who visited Prague in later generations often asked about the great bell in the highest tower, curious about its size and its beautiful sound. The people of the city would tell them of the silent bellmaker, a craftsman who never spoke a single word in his entire life, yet whose greatest creation could be heard for miles in every direction. They would explain how silence and sound could live together within the same person, how a man denied one gift could discover another far greater than anyone expected. Some who heard the story doubted that a mute man could truly create something so magnificent, believing perhaps that the tale had grown taller with each retelling, as old stories often do. But those who had stood beneath the cathedral tower and heard the bell ring with their own ears never doubted it for a moment. They understood in a way that words alone could never fully explain, that Jacob's silence had never truly been silenced at all. It had simply been a voice waiting for the right shape to carry it into the world. And so, centuries later, when the bell called the voice of Bohemia still rings out over Prague, marking the hours and the seasons and the great moments of the city's long history, those who listen closely say they can still hear something more within its deep and steady tone. They say they can hear the quiet patience of a boy who lost his voice as a child. They say they can hear the steady hands of a craftsman who spent his life shaping bronze into song. And they say, if you listen closely enough, on a still evening when the city itself seems to hold its breath, you can hear the voice of a silent man who found, in the end, the loudest voice in all of Bohemia. Some years after the casting of the voice of Bohemia, a young boy named Petra came to Jakub's workshop seeking work. Petra was the son of a poor farmer from a village outside Prague, and he had walked for 2 full days to reach the city, carrying nothing but a small bundle of bread and a fierce determination to learn a trade that might lift his family out of hardship. Jakub was older now, his hair touched with gray, his hands still steady, but slower than they once were. He looked at the boy standing in his doorway, thin and travel-worn, and saw something familiar in his eyes. A quiet patience that reminded him of himself many years before. He waved the boy inside without a word, as was his custom, and set him to work sweeping the floor of the workshop. The same first task old Havl had once given him. Petra proved himself eager and careful in the months that followed. Unlike some boys who found the silence of the workshop strange or unsettling, Petra seemed to welcome it. He had grown up in a large and noisy family, with 6 brothers and sisters filling his home with constant chatter, and he found a certain comfort in the quiet rhythm of Jakub's world, where every sound had purpose and every silence had meaning. Jakub taught him slowly, the way he had been taught himself, starting with simple tasks and building toward greater skill over many seasons. He taught Petra how to mix the bronze in proper measure. He taught him how to build a mold, layer by careful layer. He taught him, most importantly, how to listen, truly listen, to the metal itself, to sense its readiness through touch and sound, rather than through instruments or measurements alone. One evening, as they worked together, shaping a small bell for a village church, Petra asked Jakub a question he had wondered about for a long time, but never dared to voice. He asked, in his own simple way, whether Jakub had ever grown angry about losing his voice as a child, whether he had ever wished, even for a moment, that the fever had spared him instead of taking his words away. Jakub set down his tools and considered the question carefully. Then he led Petrov outside the workshop and pointed upward, toward the distant cathedral tower, where the voice of Bohemia hung silent in the evening air, waiting for the next hour to strike. Petra understood without needing further explanation. Whatever had been taken from Jakub as a boy, something far greater had grown in its place, something that now rang out over an entire kingdom. In the autumn of a difficult year, heavy rains fell across Bohemia for nearly 2 full weeks without pause. The river Vltava rose higher than anyone in Prague could remember, swelling over its banks and flooding the lower streets near the water. Homes were damaged. Bridges were threatened. The people of the city grew fearful as the waters continued to climb with each passing day. Jakub's workshop stood dangerously close to the riverbank, and as the flood worsened, he and Petra worked through the night to move their most precious tools and half-finished bells to higher ground. They carried heavy molds up narrow stairs, waded through ankle-deep water in the workshop's lower floor, and worked until their arms ached and their clothes were soaked through with cold rain and river water alike. During the worst night of the flood, when the water seemed likely to overtake much of the lower city, the great bell in the cathedral tower began to ring, struck again and again by the frightened bell ringers who hoped its voice might somehow warn distant villages downstream of the danger rushing toward them. The deep tone of the voice of Bohemia carried far across the flooded valley. And in the days that followed, several villages reported that the warning had given them just enough time to move their livestock and belongings to safety before the worst of the water arrived. Jakub stood on a hill above the flooded city that night, watching the dark water swirl below and listening to the bell he had made so many years before, doing exactly what he had always hoped a bell could do, protecting the people who lived within the sound of its voice. Petra stood beside him, silent himself for once, understanding in that moment the true weight of the craft his master had spent a lifetime perfecting. When the floodwaters finally receded, after many difficult days, the people of Prague began the slow work of rebuilding their damaged homes and streets. Jakub's workshop had suffered some damage, its lower floor thick with mud and debris, but the tools and molds they had saved allowed him and Petrov to resume their work within a few short weeks. Many in the city later said that the flood would have claimed far more lives and homes had the great bell not rung out its warning. Through the darkest hours of that terrible night, a few years later, rumors began to spread through Bohemia of gathering armies along the kingdom's distant borders. Nobles spoke in worried tones of the need for cannons and weapons to defend the kingdom. And some among the royal council suggested that church bells across the land should be melted down and recast as instruments of war, their bronze repurposed to protect the kingdom in a different way entirely. This suggestion troubled Jakub more deeply than almost anything else in his long career. He had spent his entire life giving voice to bronze, shaping it into instruments of peace and celebration and warning, and the thought of that same bronze being reshaped into weapons of destruction weighed heavily upon him. He could not speak against the proposal in any council chamber, but he found another way to make his feelings known. Jakub traveled to the bishop's residence, carrying with him a small bell he had crafted specially for this purpose, one that rang with a tone unlike any he had made before, mournful and pleading all at once. He presented the bell to the bishop without a single written word, simply ringing it once in the quiet chamber and then bowing his head waiting for the bishop to understand the message carried within its sound. The bishop, who had known Jakub for many years and trusted his judgment in all matters concerning bells, understood the silent plea completely. He brought the small bell before the royal council the following week, ringing it himself as he argued against the melting of church bells for war material. He reminded the council that the bells of Bohemia had protected the kingdom in countless quiet ways over the generations, warning of floods and fires, calling communities together in times of need, and that their voices should not be silenced to build weapons for a war that might yet be avoided through other means. The council ultimately decided against melting the church bells, choosing instead to raise new taxes to fund whatever defenses the kingdom might require. Whether the small, mournful bell Jakub had crafted truly swayed their decision, no one could say for certain, but the bishop always believed it had played its part, and the great bells of Bohemia continued to ring undisturbed over the towns and villages of the kingdom for many years afterward. As the years passed, Jakub grew old, though his passion for the craft never diminished. His hands grew weaker, and Petra, now a skilled bellmaker in his own right, took on more and more of the heavy work within the workshop. Yet, Jakub still came to the workshop every single day, still ran his fingers along cooling bronze to check for flaws, still tilted his head to listen for the true voice hidden within each new bell. Toman, now a grown man with children of his own, still visited whenever his duties at the bakery allowed. He would bring his own son and daughter to meet the old bellmaker, telling them the story of the great bell in the cathedral tower and the silent man who had created it so many years before. The children would sit at Jakub's feet in the workshop, wide-eyed and curious, watching him shape small trinkets of bronze for them to keep, tiny bells that rang with delicate, playful tones perfectly suited to a child's ear. On quiet evenings, Jakub often walked alone to the base of the cathedral, sitting on a stone bench where he could hear the voice of Bohemia ring out the evening hour. He would close his eyes and let the deep tone wash over him, feeling, as he always had since that first ringing so many years before, a sense of peace that no words could ever fully capture. He had spent his entire life without a spoken voice, yet he had never once felt that he lacked one. His voice lived in bronze, scattered across towers and chapels throughout the kingdom of Bohemia, ringing out day after day, year after year, long after his own hands had grown too tired to shape another bell. He thought often, in these quiet evening hours, of his mother, who had never stopped believing in him, even during the darkest days of his childhood illness. He thought of old Havl, who had seen something worthwhile in a silent boy and had given him a craft to fill the space where words once lived. He thought of every apprentice he had trained, every bell he had cast, every voice he had helped bring into the world through fire and bronze and patient, careful hands. In the last year of his life, Jakub undertook one final commission, a small bell intended for a modest chapel in the village where he had been born, the very village where the fever had taken his voice as a child so many decades before. He wished, though he could not explain why in words, to give something back to the place that had shaped the beginning of his story, to complete a circle that had started with silence and grown into a lifetime of song. Petra helped him with the heavier work, but Jakub insisted on shaping the final details himself, running his weakened hands over the wax mold with the same careful attention he had given to every bell before it, from the smallest chapel bell to the great voice of Bohemia itself. He inscribed no grand words into this final bell, choosing instead a simple pattern of wheat and vines, symbols of the humble farming village where his own story had begun. When the small bell was finally cast and cooled, Jakub carried it himself to his birth village, riding in a cart alongside Petra and Toman, both of whom insisted on accompanying him for this final journey. The village had changed much since his childhood, though the fields still stretched golden and wide around its edges, much as he remembered them from the days before the fever came. The village priest hung the small bell in the modest chapel tower, and Jakub asked, through gesture alone, to be the one who rang it for the very first time. He took hold of the rope with hands that trembled slightly with age, and pulled it downward with all the strength that remained in his tired arms. The bell rang out, clear and sweet, across the quiet fields, a gentle voice fitting perfectly for the small village it now called home. Jakub stood listening until the sound faded completely into silence, and those who watched him that day said his face held an expression of deep and complete peace, as though some long, unfinished part of his life had finally, after all those years, come to its proper close. Jakub passed from this world peacefully during the following winter, in his own small home, near the workshop that had been his life's true home for over 50 years. Petra found him one quiet morning, resting as though merely asleep, a faint and peaceful expression still upon his face. The bishop, upon hearing the news, ordered that every bell in Prague be rung together on the day of Jakub's funeral, an honor rarely given to anyone outside the royal family itself. And so, on that cold winter morning, as Jakub's simple wooden coffin was carried through the streets toward the cemetery outside the city walls, every bell in Prague rang out at once, dozens of voices blending together into a single overwhelming sound that rolled across the rooftops and echoed off the ancient stone walls of the city. Above them all, deeper and richer than every other voice, rang the voice of Bohemia, the great bell Jakub had poured with his own hands so many years before, now marking the passing of its own creator with the same solemn dignity it had brought to every important moment in the kingdom's history since its casting. The people of Prague gathered in great numbers along the funeral procession, many of them people who had never once heard Jakub speak a single word, yet who felt, in that moment, that they understood him completely through the voices of the bells surrounding them. Toman stood among the crowd with his own grown children, tears in his eyes, as he listened to the sound of dozens of bells his old friend had touched in one way or another throughout his long and quiet life. Petra took over the workshop after Jakub's passing, continuing the craft his master had taught him with the same care and patience Jakub himself had learned from old Havl decades before. He trained his own apprentices in time, passing down not only the technical skills of bell casting, but also the deeper lesson Jakub had taught him, without ever needing words at all, that a voice could take many forms, and that the truest voices often emerged from the quietest places. Centuries have now passed since Jakub lived and worked in his small workshop beside the river Vltava. The city of Prague has changed in countless ways since the year 1518. Its streets widened, its buildings rebuilt and renewed many times over through the passing generations. Yet high above the old city, in the same cathedral tower where it was first raised so long ago, the voice of Bohemia still hangs, and it still rings. Visitors to Prague who happen to stand beneath the cathedral tower at the striking of the hour often remark on the depth and beauty of the great bell's tone, unaware of the silent craftsman who poured it from molten bronze so many centuries before. Local guides sometimes share the old story with curious travelers, telling of the mute bellmaker who lost his voice as a child and found it again in fire and metal, whose greatest creation still speaks for an entire kingdom long after his own name has faded from common memory. The small chapel bell in his birth village still rings as well, its gentler voice calling farmers in from distant fields, much as it did on the very first day Jakub rang it himself with his own trembling, aging hands. And scattered throughout Bohemia, in towers and chapels both grand and humble, other bells, crafted by Jakub and his students and their students in turn, continue to mark the hours and seasons of countless ordinary lives, carrying forward a legacy of careful, patient craftsmanship that began with a silent boy and a kind old uncle in a small workshop by the river. Perhaps this is the truest lesson found within the story of the silent bellmaker of Prague. A voice lost is not always a voice gone forever. Sometimes it simply waits, patient and quiet, for the right shape to carry it forward into the world, ringing out across centuries long after the hands that first gave it form have returned to the earth. And so, whenever the great bells of Prague ring out over the city, whether marking a joyful wedding, a solemn funeral, or simply the steady passing of another ordinary hour, a small part of that ancient silent craftsman still speaks, carried forward on every single note. Before his final years arrived, during a winter when Jakub was still strong enough to work most days beside Petra in the workshop, a stranger came to Prague seeking his help. This man was a merchant from a distant town near the mountains, and he arrived at the workshop door wrapped in a heavy fur coat. His face reddened from days of hard travel through the snow. The merchant explained, through a long and winding story told to Petrov, since Jakub could not answer him directly, that his own son had suffered the very same fever many years before that had once taken Jakub's voice as a boy. The son, now grown, had never spoken a single word in his entire life, and the merchant had heard tales, even in his distant mountain town, of a silent bellmaker in Prague who had built the greatest bell in the kingdom, despite his own lost voice. The merchant asked if Jakub might meet with his son, who had traveled with him and now stood quietly outside in the cold, too shy and uncertain to enter the workshop on his own. Jakub set down his tools at once and went outside himself, finding a boy of perhaps 15 years standing beside a horse cart, his eyes downcast, his shoulders hunched as though trying to make himself smaller and less noticeable to the world around him. Jakub did not speak, of course. But he did something the boy clearly did not expect. He smiled warmly and without hesitation and gestured for the boy to follow him inside. For the rest of that day, Jacob showed the boy every part of his craft, letting him feel the warmth of the furnace from a safe distance, letting him run his fingers along the smooth curve of a half-finished bell, letting him hold a small hammer and strike a finished bell himself, listening together as the clear note rang out through the workshop. The boy stayed in Prague with his father for nearly a week, returning to the workshop each day to learn a little more from the silent master. When the time came for them to return home, the boy carried with him a small bell Jakub had given him as a gift, along with something perhaps even more valuable: the quiet understanding that his silence did not need to be a limitation, that it could instead become the foundation for a life filled with purpose and skill, and even, in its own way, a voice all his own. The merchant thanked Jakub many times before departing, though Jakub simply nodded in his usual manner, uncomfortable as always with praise directed toward himself rather than toward his work. Years later, word reached Prague that the boy had become a respected craftsman in his own mountain town, working with wood rather than bronze, but carrying forward the same lesson he had learned during that single winter week in Jakub's workshop. Perhaps the greatest test of the voice of Bohemia's fame came during the coronation of a new king, an event that drew nobles and dignitaries from across Europe to witness the ceremony held within Prague's great cathedral. The bishop insisted that the voice of Bohemia ring out at the precise moment the crown was placed upon the new king's head, marking the occasion with the same solemn grandeur it had brought to every important event since its casting. Jakub, though many years past the day of its original pouring, was invited to stand within the cathedral itself during this historic ceremony, a rare honor for a craftsman of his humble background. He stood quietly near a stone pillar, watching the elaborate procession of nobles and priests moving through the great hall, listening to the choir's voices rising and falling beneath the vaulted ceiling far above. When the moment finally arrived and the crown was lowered onto the new king's head, the bell ringers high above in the tower struck the voice of Bohemia with all their strength. Its deep tone rolled down through the cathedral's stone walls, filling every corner of the great hall, causing even the most composed nobles present to pause and look upward in wonder at the sound surrounding them. The new king himself, after the ceremony concluded, asked to meet the craftsman who had created such a magnificent bell. Jakub was brought before the young monarch, and though he could offer no spoken greeting, he bowed deeply, showing the respect due to his new ruler. The king, having heard the story of the silent bellmaker from his advisors, took Jakub's weathered hand in his own and thanked him personally for the gift his bell had given to this important day and to the kingdom as a whole. It was a moment Jakub never forgot, not because of the honor shown to him personally, though that honor touched him deeply, but because it confirmed something he had believed since that very first ringing so many years before. A voice made of bronze could reach places a spoken voice never could stand within the grandest halls of the kingdom and speak on equal terms with kings and bishops alike, needing no permission and no translation, understood immediately by every single person who heard it ring. He returned to his workshop that evening and told Petra the entire story through careful gestures and simple drawings. And Petra, listening closely, understood once again why his master had never seemed troubled by his silence, why he had built an entire life of meaning and purpose without ever needing to speak a single word aloud. Many years after Jakub had passed from this world, Toman himself grew old. His hair turned white, his once quick steps slowed by age. He had told the story of the silent bellmaker so many times over the decades that it had become something of a family legend, passed down first to his own children and later to his grandchildren, who gathered around him on winter evenings to hear the tale once more. One granddaughter in particular, a curious girl named Agnieszka, never tired of asking questions about the silent man her grandfather had known so well in his youth. She wanted to know what his workshop smelled like, what his hands looked like when he worked, whether he ever seemed sad about his lost voice, and how exactly a bell could carry so much meaning within a single ringing tone. Toman answered each question patiently, drawing on memories that had grown only more vivid to him with the passing years, as old memories sometimes do when they are cherished and retold often enough. He told her that the workshop always smelled of smoke and hot metal, a smell he still associated with safety and wonder, even in his old age. He told her that Jakub's hands were rough and scarred from decades of work with fire and bronze, yet somehow always gentle whenever they touched something delicate, whether a half-formed bell mold or a child's small shoulder. As for whether Jakub seemed sad, Toman always answered this question the same way, telling his granddaughter that he never once saw sadness in the old bellmaker's eyes, not even during the most difficult days of doubt before the great casting, not even during the long nights of worry that came before every important commission. Instead, Toman said, he saw something closer to quiet contentment, the look of a man who had found exactly the right way to spend his life, even if that way looked different from what most people expected. Agnieszka grew up hearing this story so many times that she eventually decided, as a young woman, to visit the cathedral herself and stand beneath the tower where the voice of Bohemia still hung, wanting to hear with her own ears the bell that had meant so much to her grandfather and to the silent man he had loved as a dear friend. She stood in the square on a cold morning, waiting for the hour to strike. And when the great bell finally rang out above her, filling the square with its deep and steady voice, she understood at last why her grandfather had never tired of telling this particular story. She returned home that evening and told her own grandfather, now very old and weak, that she had finally heard the voice of Bohemia with her own ears, and that it had sounded exactly as magnificent as he had always described it. Toman smiled at this news, his eyes growing bright with old memories, and he told her that somewhere within that deep and ancient tome, a quiet and patient man was still speaking, still sharing with the world everything he had never been able to say with mere words alone. And so the story continued to pass from generation to generation throughout Prague, carried forward not through Jakub's own voice, which the world had never once heard, but through the voices of those who loved him, and through the enduring bronze voice of the great bell he had given to his city so many centuries before, a voice that rings still today, patient and steady, for anyone willing to stop and listen. The end.